I feel more comfortable than remain seated. So the topic I will try to address is about electricity, and mainly the role electricity can play in a sustainable development policy. And first of all, I will briefly remind you of some facts which are well known. You know that most of governments have embarked into very ambitious objectives as regards 2050. Of course, these are aspirational objectives, but the reality is not that. The reality is that the emissions, the CO2 emissions, the greenhouse emissions are stagnating and sometimes increasing very rapidly in developing countries. Well, clearly, we are not in line with the objectives which have been adopted by most countries for 2050. And the pledges taken by most countries after the Copenhagen meeting are not in line with the 2015 objective, 50 objective. Electricity is in a very paradoxical situation, because clearly today a very important portion of the increase of the CO2 emission is due to electricity generation, in real terms and in percentage. In Europe, in Asia, in all the countries. So electricity is responsible for most of this increase. And at the same time, the solution may come from electricity. So why? This is totally paradoxical. Why? It's a question of thermodynamics. Maybe some of you have some memories about the second principle of thermodynamics. But that's very important, because most people make a confusion between the energy crisis, the energy issues, and the climate issue. This is totally different. Climate issues, it's not a question of, has nothing to deal with depletion of resources. Climate issues is a question of entropy. It's a question of disorder which is introduced by the human activities. I remind you that it took 100 million years for the sun, for the Earth's heat, 100 million years to transform the CO2 in the atmosphere into the oil fields and the oil and the coal fields. And now the man is putting everything into disorder. But thanks to electricity, we can work around the second principle of thermodynamics at the generation level and at the end user level. Maybe, it's not sure, that's all the debate. Today the situation is very, very bad. We are very far from a low decarbonized power sector. And a totally decarbonized power sector is absolutely indispensable if we want the target of 80% of CO2 emission reduction to be reached in 2050. It's very easy to demonstrate, because we will still need CO2 emission for certain applications such as chemical industry, such as transportation. So if we want to reach this ambitious target of 80% of CO2 emission reduction in 2050, that means that the power sector must be almost totally decarbonized. And today the situation is very far from that. The carbon factor, that means how much CO2 you are currently emitting for producing 1 kilowatt per hour. This carbon factor depends on the country. It's still very high in China, in India, in Russia. In Europe, it's an average. In France, we are in a relatively good situation, because we have a very strong nuclear generation, sorry for that. And we only, on average, are only emitting 32 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, instead of 900 grams in China. But another issue is that the power demand will continue to grow everywhere in the world, and notably in Europe. everywhere, in industry, in service, in transport, in residential, and this is indispensable. If you want to decarbonize the transport sector, you must progressively, or if possible rapidly, introduce electrical vehicles. Of course, energy efficiency is something very important, but don't believe that you can solve all the problem only with energy efficiency. We will still need energy. And on average, we can consider that energy efficiency, as far as electricity is concerned, will more or less compensate for new uses of electricity. It will be balanced, roughly speaking. So the problem remains, how can we do in order to decarbonize the power sector? There are a lot of studies about this case. But in Europe, we immediately realize that the solution is not obvious. And we have three main pillars, only three, having spoken about energy efficiency. Three main pillars: nuclear, renewables, and fossil fuels with capture and storage of CO2. Roughly speaking, we can consider that nuclear in Europe, may provide 30–40% of power generation in 2050. No more. It's not realistic to imagine that it could be more. Renewables, it's a big question mark, and it needs further debate. On this graph, we assume that it could be 30, and remain fossil fuel. Fossil will need to be decarbonized thanks to capture and storage, carbon capture and storage. In this hypothesis, we can have reached the 100%. But is it achievable? As regards nuclear energy, the Passage magazine recently completed a comprehensive study about the situation of nuclear energy in France and also around the world. And Émile Mallet published last week, make a press conference about the last magazine, number 8063, which is entirely dedicated to nuclear. I will not enter into the details. Just I would like to underline some important points. First of all is that nuclear remains more competitive in France in comparison with all other solutions, all other non-emitting, non-CO2 emitting solutions. The figures you have in front of you are from International Energy Agency, and they clearly show that the last reactor, the EPR, may produce energy with a cost significantly lower than wind energy, offshore, onshore or offshore, biogas or solar photovoltaics. Nuclear energy market is revitalizing. It's again growing everywhere in the world, especially in India. And we believe that it's realistic to consider that in 2050 we will have around 750 reactors working in operation around the world, compared today to 437. Right now there are 55 reactors under construction, most of them in India. And for the long term, France has decided to accelerate its efforts in the fourth generation in the fast reactor field, and has decided to engage, to start the design studies of a new reactor, a sodium-cooled fast reactor, which could be built around 2020. And if this policy is successful, and I do hope that it can be successful, the waste case, which is still a delicate issue, should be significantly